My name is Chris Reed. I'm the publicist at University of Toronto Press. It's my great honor to welcome everybody this evening to one of our UTP talks. As we do, UTP Talks is a new webinar series that we've started and where we like to have our experts talk to one another about topical issues. And this evening, the issue will be the Paris Agreement. It's the fifth, this December marks the fifth anniversary, and so we will be discussing the merits of the Paris Agreement. And so, without further ado, I would like to acknowledge do the land acknowledgement for the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet on this land. And as I said a minute ago, our moderator this evening, I'm very delighted to say, is Sara Burch. And Dr. Burch is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo here in Canada. And Dr. Burch has published widely on processes for visualizing climate change impacts, adaptation, and migration options at the community scale. As I said, Dr. Burch is also the co-author of a foundational text that we published here at University of Toronto Press called Understanding Climate Change. And it's my great honor to hand things over to Dr. Burch. Dr. Burch.
Great. Hello. Good evening or early afternoon or whatever time of day it is, depending on your time zone. I'm thrilled to be here today with these excellent authors talking about this important issue. So I'm going to begin by introducing them each in turn first before we move on to some questions and discussion and some time for questions and answers from you all at the end. So first, we have Rae André, who is a climate change educator and best-selling author. She teaches leadership and sustainability at DeMoore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University as professor emeritus, and consults on integrating planetary sustainability into business school and other university curricula. Her popular press books include Take Back the Sky, Protecting Communities in the Path of Aviation Expansion, Positive Solitude, and the 59-Second Employee, How to Stay 1 Second Ahead of Your 1-Minute Manager. Next, we have Mireille Ghoussoub, who is co-author of The Story of CO2, Big Ideas for a Small Molecule. She holds a PhD in materials chemistry from the University of Toronto, where she studied reaction pathways on the surface of metal oxide catalysts for converting carbon dioxide to methanol. She completed her Bachelor of Applied Science in Engineering Physics at the University of British Columbia, also where I did my PhD, and her Master's of Applied Science in Materials Engineering at the University of Toronto. So welcome, Rae. And we have David Miller, who is the Director of International Diplomacy and Global Ambassador of Inclusive Climate Action at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. He is responsible for supporting nearly 100 mayors of the world's largest cities in their climate leadership and building a global movement for socially equitable action to mitigate and adapt to climate change. He served as chair of C40 cities from 2008 until 2010. And David Miller, of course, was mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010. Under his leadership, Toronto became widely admired internationally for its environmental leadership, economic strength, and social integration. So welcome, Rae, and David. We're thrilled to have you here. So let's get rolling. If you don't mind, I have one question. Oh, you know what, before I do, it occurred to me that perhaps some of the couple of hundred of you on this call may not be too familiar with the Paris Agreement. So let me just give 2 or 3 sentences for everybody on what that is, so that we can at least start from a sort of similar vantage point. So you may know that the Paris Agreement built on the foundation laid by the Kyoto Protocol, which is part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Global Treaty on Climate Change. It was negotiated in the 21st Conference of the Parties in Paris in 2015, 5 years ago almost today. and entered into force in November of 2016. And the central aim of the Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to climate change by keeping global temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that is the ambition of the Paris Agreement. And we're taking this moment after 5 years to sort of look back on progress and opportunities, pitfalls associated with that global negotiation process around climate change. So my first question, each of the panelists for this question will just have a couple of minutes to offer their reflections, and then we'll get into, I hope, a more free-flowing discussion. So my question, beginning with Rae and then moving on to Mireille and then David, is just broadly speaking, how did the Paris Agreement influence you as you were writing, as you were thinking about climate change in the process of writing your book? So what role did it play as you wrote? Right?
So thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really glad that you asked us to examine the Accords through our own particular lens. And my particular lens happens to be organizational psychology. So in 5 years, Paris has accomplished actually fairly little to reduce greenhouse gases and keep our temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And why is that? I see the Paris process as an example of the limitations of human decision-making, and in some ways as a warning. So readers of my book are concerned citizens from all walks of life who want to know how they can contribute to solving the climate crisis. And in the book, I describe a set of 5 broad practices that can help them decide where best to put their own energy. I did not set out to make any policy recommendations, but in the end, I do believe that the social science I consulted can contribute to the policy conversation. So we're all members of what I like to call team humanity. And like any team that makes decisions, team humanity has both strengths and weaknesses. To address the climate crisis, we must minimize our decision-making weaknesses and play to our decision-making strengths. Again, my expertise is as a psychologist. So the decision-making process of Paris is based on achieving cooperation, and as such, it has many flaws. To name just one, the agreement is designed on the principle of parochial altruism, what we call in lay terms tribalism. And in the agreement, each country simply sets its own goals, and there is no mechanism for accountability to a global plan. Encouragement, yes, but accountability, no. In fact, the eminent social scientists that I quote in my book are quite pessimistic about team humanity's ability to cooperate on a grand scale to solve global problems like climate change. For example, leading researchers on tribalism have little hope that we can overcome it. They conclude that humans do have an intuition to cooperate, but that unfortunately this intuition is not strong enough to advance systemic goals like world peace and, of course, solving climate change. So what's the answer? Fortunately, team humanity does have some decision-making strengths to fall back on. In fact, we still have the kind of innovative and entrepreneurial strengths that got us into this mess in the first place by turning black goo into essentially gold. To sum it all up, in addition, to address the climate crisis, it may be that team humanity should put fewer chips down on cooperation and place some more chips on innovation and entrepreneurship.
Great. Thank you very much, Rae. Sorry, just searching for my unmute. That's a great place to start. And I'll pass it to Mireille for her couple of minutes on the Paris Agreement and her writing.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to begin by saying that I'm coming to you today from Taka, Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I wish to express my gratitude for their care and stewardship of this land and water over the course of millennia. So my PhD supervisor and I, we started seriously working on our book, The Story of CO2, back in 2017. I was doing my PhD through the process, so it all took a while. But our goal of our book was we wanted to showcase from a chemist perspective the field of CO2 utilization and all this really exciting emerging science and technology that the field has to offer. So I have to admit that it was in researching to write the book that I got to reading about the Paris Agreement more seriously. And and there is a case to be made that the Paris Agreement offers a point of reference against which we can assess our progress. And in particular, I think the framework of working with temperature targets as opposed to just cumulative budgets or atmospheric concentration, for me, it was very powerful to help understand what is at stake. But the more I read, the more I was truly taken aback by its inadequacy. If every country fulfilled its nationally determined contribution, it wouldn't be enough. And in addition to that, we're nowhere near to meeting the targets. So, all this reading about the emissions gap we face, it made me really want to rely and trust in these technological measures that offer deep decarbonization, that claim to, at least things like direct air capture and geological storage. And these are topics that we address in our book. But I'm here to tell you that these cannot be deployed overnight, and certainly not at the scale required to meet the targets. So the point is, this is not a tech problem. In Canada, we spend on the order of $3 billion in oil and gas subsidies every year. Globally, after Paris is signed, we continue to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. And meeting our targets requires that this industry phases out and that it's eventually completely dismantled. I liken it to we're in a boat and there's a hole and water is gushing in and we're up to our necks now, we're almost drowning. And the solution is to put the plug. So that's where I want to start off.
Great, thanks for that, Mireille. All right, and now David, your 2 minutes.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm very much enjoying the privilege of being on this panel and listening to Rae and Mireille, who both have very interesting and different perspectives than mine, because they start from a different place. I start from the place, both from the role of cities in actually addressing climate change, and also from the place of politics, having been an elected official, and understand, at least to some degree, the political forces at play. And from my perspective, Paris was both completely flawed and an absolute wild success at the moment it was signed. It's completely flawed because what nations agreed to do was not nearly sufficient to get us on a path to holding overall global heating to 1.5 degrees, which is what is scientifically necessary. But it was also a tremendous success because nations actually agreed. And it gave people like businesses permission to act. Unfortunately, relatively soon after Paris, the United States elected a government, as did Brazil, who behaved like climate deniers and eroded that permission. So we're now 5 years after Paris. The hope we had at the time for national government action and leadership has proven to be a little bit false. But at the same time, what we've seen, and we've seen this for over 15 years at least, there has been enormous leadership of mayors and city governments globally on the issue of climate change, from committing to 1.5 degree trajectories, to building plans to achieve that, to including equity in those plans, and to addressing the underlying sources of greenhouse gas emissions that we have to meet if the world is going to do what's necessary. And I'm optimistic, and the argument I make in Solved is that if we take the best things that are happening today, that are economically and technically feasible in a city in the world, and do them at pace and scale across every city, we can actually get back on a 1.5 degree trajectory. And that allows us the political space and time to solve some of the harder problems, or perhaps invent some new things. I'm less optimistic than others about technology solving the problems, but I am optimistic, given the examples we've seen of city-based leadership, that if we scale up what's happening, we can honor the original spirit of Paris, but go much further and do actually what's needed to do.
Great, thanks for that. So it seems to me that we have different levels of optimism. We have different perspectives on what we think came out of Paris, some of which is hard to track. It's hard to know whether Paris influenced a person, a leader, a decision maker's perspective or not. So there's an open question there, I guess. But you all referred to, in your little a couple of minutes there, you referred implicitly or explicitly to a different scale of sort of actor, that perhaps you have different perspectives on the one hand, who is really responsible for leading the charge, and then kind of a separate, like the flip side of that coin is there might be this group or actor or whatever level of government that's responsible, but it's a different actor or level of government or whatever that actually has the most potential and that we're really seeing the solutions come from. So I wonder if you could kind of reflect on that dichotomy. Is the group or the level of government that you feel is responsible for leading the charge on climate change also the one that's making the most progress, or not? And I think you can jump in any order at this point. Let's just try and open it up instead of going around the circle. Thoughts?
Well, maybe I'll jump in first since nobody else unmuted. First of all, I think of them as orders of government because subnational governments like states and provinces have a role, national governments have a role, cities have a role. If you analyze, but the place to start is where do the emissions come from? And if you analyze global emissions through the lens of where people live, and today more people live in cities than live outside cities, and that's only been true for about the last decade, from the dawn of humanity till around 11 or 12 years ago, we were predominantly rural. Now we're predominantly urban. And not surprisingly, most emissions, about 70%, can be attributed to cities or the activities needed to sustain them. Like if a power plant's outside the city, it still counts as inside of the city in that calculation. If you analyze it that way, and then look at where those emissions come from, you see that it's predominantly from how we heat and cool buildings, transportation, how we generate electricity, and how we manage our waste. Now, sometimes those things are the responsibilities of individual people, mostly not. Occasionally, they're the responsibility of businesses. Often, they're the responsibility of city government. Sometimes, subnational, like provincial governments in Canada being responsible for electricity. Sometimes national governments in the case of some transportation regulations and funding, for example. But the fact remains that those are the areas that we need to address and in which there's innovative ideas. So for me, I don't start with who's responsible for it. I start with what do we need to do. And if we can speak to people and clearly and simply demonstrate what it is we need to do, they'll ensure that the governments actually take the right steps. It's very clear that people are seriously concerned about climate change, but they need a path. And those of us who are more involved in the issue need to help them find that path. And to me, it leads through cities.
I couldn't agree more with David in terms of it comes through people and through cities. I take a kind of, because of my own psychological bent, I take a kind of more individualistic perspective on the one sense that everybody's got to get on board here, and everybody has to. Everybody who's at the least in the least bit concerned has to think of themselves as a leader, consider what their skills are, and then get involved whatever their skills. So some people will work on some aspects of cities, other people will work more locally, perhaps in their community, whatever. But I also think that, you know, David says they need a path. And I think in more psychological terms, they need a plan. It's like if you're going to try to lose weight, you're not going to just say, I got to lose weight. We've all learned that that doesn't work. We have to count calories. And people like that. They like to say, well, I've got X number of carbon credits that I can use today, and if I could cut it down, then that's self-reinforcing. And so that plays out not just for the individual, but for the city, but for the country. So there are a few people in the world who have put together plans that work, or that could work, that have the kind of grit, the kind of specificity that allow people to say, well, I just did my thing today, and it helped in this small way, but at least I can see that it counts. And so I think what we need in part is leaders who are willing to create these plans. I think Bill Gates is about to come out with a book. Maybe he's got a particular plan. He certainly has carved up the world in terms of what areas he thinks need to be changed. The late David McKay had a very fascinating plan that you can read online. He's a British physicist. We're actually added it all up, and I think people really are crying out for that.
So that's really interesting. I think University of Toronto Press knew that as a moderator, it would be painful for me to not jump in and add my own perspective, but I'm not going to. I think what I'm hearing is that there's some tensions there between whether this is an individual responsibility or a collective responsibility, and whether those who are responsible for the emissions, if we trace those emissions to their source, if those entities also have the resources and capacities they need to then deal with those emissions that they're responsible for. So I think, we've raised a couple of those points as well. Rae, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to quickly say, I really tend to agree with Rae's comment on how, ultimately we're going to need many different actors, and people are going to have to bring different perspectives and different skill sets to this. We're going to need, the activist has a role to play in this, as does the politician. Very quickly, though, nobody needs to count calories or lose weight. That is rather fat-phobic, and we need to be worrying about cutting out our emissions, not our weight, is what I wanted to say. And to build on what Sara was saying, I think it is tremendously important that we consider the people, like, we are not responsible as individuals for our emissions. And historically, it is the global north that has done by far most of the polluting. They are responsible for the bulk of our legacy emissions. And in that sense, it's really, the onus should really be on particular countries in the global north who have benefited from really exploitative and extractive industries. And they're also the ones with the capacities to make the most transformative change, technologically speaking. That's all I wanted to add.
That's great. Thanks for that response from either of you, from Rae or David.
I just wanted to add, sorry if I jumped in, Rae. I didn't mean to imply that it's the duty of individuals. I was trying to make a different point. This is a collective problem that we need to address. And we need to address it in a just way for the points, because of the points Mireille just made. It's, essentially caused by the richest globally and to some extent within countries. And the impact is on the least well-off globally, and certainly within cities. There's lots of examples. Wall Street recovered pretty quickly after Hurricane Sandy, which was probably a climate-related event. Queens took years and years and years. And what's the difference? Queens is a working-class neighborhood. Wall Street is, the world's financial center. I think we have to solve this collectively. But if people don't see a path and don't have hope that we can solve it collectively, they're going to give up. And, in democratic countries, they're not going to support elected officials who are trying to do the right thing. And they're not going to push for better better results and actions. And to me, that's why it's so important that people have a path and know what to do. And whether it's the analogy is counting calories or not, I agree with Rae that if people see where things are going, then they're going to support that direction. And I think in some ways we've been a little bit counterproductive in the environmental movement. We've so succeeded in this terrifying message that there's this really worrying challenge for humanity called climate change, that hundreds of millions of people are going on the move globally because they won't have enough food to eat because of desertification. I can never say that. And we're going to have more and more cataclysmic storms and wildfires. People got that message, but we need to provide the other one. Here's where we need to go. And I think clarity around that, I'm not a psychologist, but certainly from the perspective of elected officials, really important to have clarity around that. As we've seen in COVID, the places that are successful dealing with COVID have been very clear and allowed people to buy in.
Thanks for that. That's actually a good segue. And I would like to also just add, I mean, I think it's the 2-degree target as well is a really interesting mechanism by which we sort of collectively rally our imaginations, you know, but 2.1 degrees of warming is better than 2.2 degrees of warming, and that's better than 2.3 degrees of warming. So, you know, we don't fall off a cliff at 2 degrees. We don't fall off a cliff at 1.5. There are more and less impacts associated with, you know, every fraction of a degree of warming that we commit to. So I think that's part of telling the story of all progress is crucial. You know, there isn't just sort of ones and zeros when it comes to success or failure on climate change. Let's take the COVID segue that you gave me there, David, and reorient this conversation a little bit to the state that we find ourselves in. We might be in person doing this panel if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic. And I think, you know, the way that we've responded to that pandemic in such wildly different ways, depending on the country that you live in, the community that you live in, the socioeconomic group that you belong to, I think really opens up an important conversation about how we deal with collective challenges. So I'd like to sort of put it back to you. Do you see any parallels between how we are responding to COVID and how we might respond, or might not, for that matter, respond to climate change? Can I start with, okay, great, go ahead.
Yeah, the main parallel I see, and I think it's very clear, is that cooperation has really been, if not quite a failure, it's been very problematic in my country, at least in the United States. There's been so much strife and discord that cooperation hasn't solved the problem, and along came science, and science solved the problem. And so the analogy for me is that cooperation is not so likely to solve the climate problem, and rather it's going to be science that will. So I don't think the analogy is perfect, but I think it's pretty telling that we have a lot of problems cooperating to get things done in this world, and we really need to get it done.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, goodness, like there's so much to talk about here. There are so many parallels because, you know, one could start by just talking about how these are very similar issues and that we are only as strong as our social structures, and those who are already made the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, will be the ones to suffer the most under major extreme weather events, and that's what we're already seeing. I could also talk about science communication and the importance of knowledge dissemination and public trust in science is another major parallel between these things. Another is just the role of media, the way we talk about individualization of responsibility and of the crisis, right? Like, can we expect to put so much onus on individual behavior? And then, I mean, and this one too, it's dark, but also one thing that concerns me is the normalization of murder, of massive death. Like, just we are living in a reality that we could not have imagined a year ago. And I hate to say it, but it's very easy to become, I'm not saying immune, but to get used to reading of this news. And in a way, we've already normalized the destruction caused by climate, I would say, because although one could say the impacts have affected most communities by now, whether it's folks on the West Coast experiencing forest fires, or it was a record-breaking hurricane season in the Atlantic, but the global South has been suffering the consequences of climate change already for years. And now with COVID, like we've all had to make sacrifices. We've all suffered one way or another, albeit to different scales, of course. But I don't even know where to begin, because there are so many ways one could approach this.
I think we should come back to this issue of trust in science, because it was an interesting, at the early days of the pandemic, it was interesting that all of a sudden to the fore came our public health officials, people we didn't know the faces and names of, were the first at the podium to sort of guide us through this. And in Canada, at least, there was a lot of rhetoric around, we're in this together, and this is a collective problem we can only solve by taking care of each other. And that's an interesting way to frame a response to the problem. David, you unmuted. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, two things really. I think, first of all, there is a renewed faith in the point you just made, Sarah, that's a collective problem that needs to be addressed collectively, or at least in our capacity through our governments to address collective problems collectively. Certainly the polling shows that. The US is a bit weird at the moment. I'm not sure, well, it's just a bit weird at the moment, but most places there is a renewed belief in a collective approach to problem solving, which through our governments, which does give an opportunity to address climate change now. So I'm sort of picking up on your point, Sarah. But secondly, we've done some research on this at C40, which isn't the subject of my book. It came out after my book was launched. But the research shows pretty persuasively that now is the moment to invest in climate solutions as the governments invest massively on stimulus to address the pandemic. So there's both a sort of an esoteric connection from my perspective and a very practical connection. The Canadian government announced today that it's going to invest $100 billion over the next 3 years entirely on stimulus. If that stimulus supports low carbon cities, electrification of transport, more public transport, highly energy efficient buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we could make massive progress on climate. On the other hand, if it builds more pipelines, we're never going to meet Canada's climate commitments ever. That decision is going to be taken over the next few months in every major country in the world. So not only kind of in the thinking and the politics of it, but the practicalities of it. There's a very real connection between climate and COVID.
Right. So some important themes, I guess, to pick up on there, or to sort of sum up that, that COVID is and will continue to be a collective challenge, whether we grapple with it as such or whether we rely on individual responsibility, I think really varies depending on the country that you're in, the community that you're in. But it is also this, and I always hesitate to use the word opportunity, but it is a crucial moment where we're having conversations about how to address the pre-existing vulnerabilities, right? The folks that were responsible, or that were vulnerable rather, before COVID, that those inequities were exposed in a lot of ways by this pandemic and revealed, created and enhanced in some ways, but also just pre-existing vulnerabilities were revealed. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's try and sort of round out our conversation with a couple minutes each before we move into some audience questions. And I apologize if my audio was terrible at first there. I hope it's better now. I really want to come back to this this tension between collective action and individual action. And regardless of where we fall on our answer to that question, if we think that this is in fact a collective challenge, a governance challenge, and I tend to be personally on that side of the equation, nonetheless, there is a role for, I think, individuals to play in charting the path forward, even if that role is just to vote. I think there's, there needs to be a path or a plan for all of the people who took the time this evening to be with us to talk about these issues. So I'd just like to offer you all the opportunity to take 2 minutes to think about where to from here. We've been reflecting back for the last 5 years on what Paris has done and what Paris hasn't done, but what do we need to do next? So let's go in the same order, perhaps, and start with Rae and Mireille and then David.
Thank you, Sarah. So I've pointed out that social scientists are skeptical about Team Humanity's ability to cooperate globally to solve the climate crisis. And I go into that in great detail in my book. We're too short-term in our thinking. We're too tribal. Our ability to trust each other is limited. In addition, cooperation takes a lot of time. We already know that just from our day-to-day experience. And it's time that we don't really have to solve the climate crisis. So fortunately, there is good news also. Team Humanity does have other strengths besides those that lend themselves to a cooperative approach. Strengths like creativity and curiosity and openness to experience and intellect, competitiveness, and plain old raw energy. And these decision-making strengths are found in abundance on Team Humanity, and they're found among our scientific innovators and our entrepreneurs. So what can concerned citizens do to help? So they can study up on climate leadership, figure out how the world can use their unique talents. And yes, we need all hands on deck, and we even need Paris. We need these cooperative institutions to help us to implement the solutions that we're working on. Maybe we need an innovation movement. Certainly we should lobby for more funds for innovation. We're currently using about $25 billion for R&D around the world, and that's a pittance compared to what it might be. And all this takes leadership. So we need to learn from leaders like Bill Gates and his associates in the Creative Capital Fund that funds promising technologies, or Janet Yellen and Mark Carney and their group of 30 who are economists who describe how to channel capital to green innovation. Finally, remember that Paris is a cautionary tale. Think twice before you assume.
Think twice before you. I think we lost Rae. All right. We thought this might happen. So if you don't mind, let's move to Mireille, and if we get Rae back, we'll come back to her.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess what I wanted to say is I don't think we can avoid talking about neoliberalism in discussing climate change. And the neoliberal approach is one that it really insists on policy solutions that are founded in the private sector's capacity to make a profit. And this has not given us the results we need. If anything, it's held us back. And we've already warmed the planet by more than 1 degree, and we're on track to warming it by 1.5 by 2030. So I want to leave the audience with the message that we need really deep transformative changes. We need to redesign our structures and our systems. And I'm not just talking about, say, transportation, but we need to reorganize ourselves so that human health and the health of our environment are the new bottom line. And we need to do this, we need to make connections with other struggles. So, environmental protections and labor protections have historically risen and fallen together, as an example. The call to defund the police which this year finally gained mainstream attention, is arguably a climate policy. Because at the end of the day, action on climate change is about the protection of human lives. And the state's policing structures continue to disproportionately brutalize Black and Indigenous people in this country, as well as in other countries. And, not to mention, imagine the billions of dollars in municipal budgets that would become available that we could invest in electrified transport, in affordable, efficient buildings, and climate adaptation projects. So what I want to leave people with, and I'll wrap up quickly, is that, here in Canada, there are constitutional grounds on which to stop fossil fuel mega projects. The federal government has distinct legal obligations that are enshrined in our Constitution to respect Indigenous control over their land. So I encourage you, wherever you are, to show your support and solidarity for Indigenous movements that are happening right now, because Indigenous leadership has always been at the forefront of the global climate movement. And in Canada, the grassroots land defenders have historically been and continue to be the last ones standing, really, between extractivist agendas and the future of the planet. So we need to follow their lead, and we need to support their actions in any way we can.
Thanks very much for that. I really appreciate that. David?
Well, that's a very powerful call, and I can be interested to read Mireille's book and interested to read Rae's as well for the psychological perspective. For me, people have an incredibly important role. Their voices matter. Speaking up matters. I've spoken on panels with so many engineers and architects from leading companies who say that they're working on greening their operations because the younger people they interview for jobs, the first question is, what are you doing on climate change? And so they've actually changed their businesses because people are speaking up. People's actions matter as well. Eating less meat, for example, choosing clean methods of transportation, including using your feet. And people's votes matter. But really, we're not going to solve this problem. We need those things to happen without really bold collective action. And there's an urgency, as Mireille just said. We need to have global emissions by 2050. And for me, the way to address that urgency is by building on the best things that are happening now that are easy to replicate. Yes, there's a huge role for entrepreneurs. Yes, there's a role for inventing new things. We don't have the time to wait for new inventions, new entrepreneurs, new economic systems. We need all of those. We need a much more circular economy, for example. We need to respect our land and everything we do. But while we're developing all of that, we need to do what we can now. And the good news is there's a path. It's clear. But people need to know it and push for it and help make it happen. Because without the support of people, particularly in making sure we have the right governments elected, it won't. And for me, I'm optimistic. I don't think people will give up. Most people understand the necessity of action. And I think the more people know what's possible, the more likely they are to make sure it happens.
Great, thanks for those thoughts. It makes me reflect that that it's a false dichotomy, I guess, to ask the question about whether or not this is an individual or a collective responsibility. That those two are deeply connected, and individuals add their voices to collective movements. They participate in the challenge, in challenging power structures as they are. They send the signals to those who represent them and decision makers that they require more ambitious action by those decision makers, and that feeds back and sustains itself. So there, it isn't certainly one or the other, but where the greatest opportunities lie, where the pressure should be put, where the resources should be put, I think is perhaps where we have some difference of opinion, which is helpful. We have a number of questions from our esteemed audience. So we have a time for a couple of them, and either of you are welcome to answer them, although I may direct them to one or the other of you. So the first one I'd like to raise, and I'd like to direct this to you, Mireille, if you're comfortable, because you sort of started to go in this direction. But you know, a lot of the time, the conversations around what to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions focus on the production side of energy, right? How to move away from fossil-based resources towards renewable energy and to start producing energy that way. And that is indeed a massive collective challenge and requires, you know, large-scale investments in infrastructure and that sort of thing. But the other side of the equation is consumption. And that in many ways is an individual responsibility, although what is available to be consumed is governed at different levels. But I wonder how important you think that conversation is about the culture around consumption, and whether or not we can come close to kind of tackling this challenge without having a tough conversation around levels of consumption. And by that, I specifically mean in wealthy, Western industrialized and privileged communities.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big question. I'll try my best. But yeah, I by no means wish to deny that consumption plays a role. It really does. And maybe I'll speak from the perspective of our book, which is specifically talking about the role of decarbonizing the chemical industry. And that one I think is really a great example, because we actually start off the book with this picture of a tree. And at the bottom of the tree, you have roots. And at the roots, you have all our most basic resources, so like water, minerals, and petrochemical products. And then at the branches of the tree, you have all the products we use and consume daily. So everything from like electronics to fertilizer, to clothing, all these things that we consume day to day. But we're not necessarily aware of the whole supply chain that leads down to the roots where they come from. So in our book, we talk about the potential to replace petrochemical products at the root with carbon dioxide to try to make this circular economy where like we can eliminate fossil from the supply chain and we can make all these feedstock chemicals using waste carbon dioxide and renewably generated hydrogen and all that. So what I'm trying to get at is, I think it's important when talking about consumption and production is that it's a whole supply chain. At every single step, you have emissions and you have some degree of consumption. So addressing this, like the individual, by all means, we have power as individuals to make choices as consumers. And it does have the power to send a signal, but market signaling alone is not going to get us where we need to go. And on top of that, we need to address every step of the supply chain. Where are the emissions at every step? How can we improve efficiency energetically? How can we decarbonize chemical manufacturing processes that actually take in a lot of refined petrochemical products? So I think that's the perspective where I'm coming from on that.
Right. Yeah, it's important to appreciate that that's an incredibly deep and complex amount of information that you then need to feed to the individual for them to make an informed decision, right? And so even gathering that data, much less passing it along in a way that would inform a consumer to consume differently is tricky business. And consumption is, you know, very deeply rooted in culture, of course, and status and such. So certainly a tough nut to crack. David, for you, I have a question about the ambition levels that we see in cities. And as you know, I do a lot of work with small businesses, and we find that, like cities, small businesses tend to be incredibly ambitious when they have sort of the mindset shift deeper than just kind of the sort of superficial decision to be slightly less environmentally damaging, when they've embedded sustainability or climate change in their business model, when they've done that sort of deeper transformation. The targets that they set and the goals they set for themselves are much more ambitious than you would see nationally or internationally. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we see that sort of exceptional level of ambition from cities?
I think there's a variety of reasons, but one of which is city governments of their nature have to do two things. regardless of what they do on climate change. They have to engage with and listen to people. It's often legislated. There's specific structures of engagement and public consultation. And so there is embedded in the DNA of city and town governments listening to people. And people are demanding action on climate change. That's where voices really matter. So that's first. The second thing that's part of the DNA of cities is they run actual services. And this is where I disagree a bit with the idea that individual action is what we need. It's a collective problem. I, as an individual, can choose to take transit, which I do most of the time. We've gotten rid of our car and we transit and walk and bike for the most part. But I can't build a new LRT, light rail transit line. I can't build a busway. I can't buy electric buses. We can only do that collectively. And the same thing with national governments. Nobody on this call can change the fact that the post office in the US and Canada doesn't buy all electric vehicles. It's absurd. They're available all over the place. So I think, that part of what cities do, they run public transit, they're responsible for parks, they oversee urban forests, they're responsible for water, they're responsible for building standards, where new buildings go, are they built in a way that encourages a 15-minute city walking and cycling. All of those things make them susceptible, with the right people elected, to actually taking real action on climate, because they can address these collective things that individuals can't do alone, and because they are very responsive to people. And if you look at the polling, it's very clear people in urban areas globally really want action on climate change. So you have a delicious combination of potential there for structural institutional reasons. And you add to that, if you get a really good mayor or council, you can do even more.
Great. Thank you for that. That was helpful. We'll just take one more quick question, and I sincerely apologize to all of the others who've posted such brilliant questions. They're really well thought out and nuanced, and I wish we had 2 more hours to talk to them all. But I'd like to return to this issue that we've sort of been dancing around. I mean, we all write books, some of us teach, some of us do research. So clearly we have in our hearts the desire to provide information of one sort or another. But we've also, sort of come collectively to the conclusion that information alone is insufficient, that it's one ingredient of changing pathways. There's deeper forces at play. So what, as scholars, as educators, as decision makers, what can we do that we haven't done to sort of build that agency for change, and add to or supply, sort of more fuel to the momentum? All right.
Wow, this is a big question. I guess what I would like to highlight here is, historically, the climate movement has been very much the environmental movement, in that I think what's happening now that's really exciting is we're seeing the youth-led climate movement worldwide. We're seeing a mainstream attention on ideas like a Green New Deal. And these ideas are really powerful because what they're shifting the narrative from one about, what's conventionally the narrative has kind of been like, what do we have to sacrifice to save the world? And this is a change in narrative into like envisioning a better future, and one that's not just focused on on reducing atmospheric CO2. We're talking about how can we actually make our lives better? How can we have affordable education? How can we how can we all have access to clean green spaces? I think something that, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, like it is happening, but we need to shift this narrative into one that is a lot more positive, that's a lot more one of growth rather than of taking something away.
Nobody really wants to sign up to freezing in the dark, right? Yeah. David?
Yeah, the question is, what can academics do? I think the fossil fuel industry, which is the primary opposition to action here, has a very well-funded political strategy and communication strategy. And the integrity of the academy is a disadvantage at this moment. I'm not suggesting it should act without integrity, but the clarity of the discussion with the public is really important at the moment, as opposed to debating ambiguity. And I think, one of the things, for example, it's really important is to address difficult underlying concerns. There's no question at all economically that running an economy that's much cleaner is far better. But there's massive transition challenges, and for some people, it won't be better. So we need to make sure that there is a just strategy for them. And it has to be for them. It can't be some elected official getting up and saying, we've created 50,000 more jobs or 50 million more jobs, which is what our research shows globally. A green and just recovery from COVID would create 50 million more jobs. That's great. But what's happening in the town around the coal-fired plant for those people and those jobs? And it needs to be that granular. So I think those two things, one's a communications issue with a clarity of purpose and message, and interesting and entertaining and fun. And the second is we have to address the underlying issue, which is a real economic uncertainty amongst people who've made their livelihood off of fossil fuels. And that uncertainty must be addressed. Otherwise, they're going to keep fighting. And so far, they've won.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that that ultimately a really core component of this challenge and how we deal with it is justice. And I'm really glad that that's where we arrived because I agree. And I think by presenting climate change as a technical challenge, completely contingent on individual changes in behavior, we've lost a lot of time. So I'm heartened to see the shift in conversation towards a just transition and a just recovery from COVID. So that's exciting stuff. I thank you both, and Rae in her absence. She may be here on audio only, for your excellent comments and discussion. And I will pass it to Chris to wrap up. You're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Speaking of technical issues and technical challenges, I would like to apologize. There is a storm in the Boston area this evening, and Rae's Wi-Fi signal was knocked out, and we were not able to patch her back in. But I do thank Sara, David, and Mireille very much for carrying the conversation forward in her absence. I did want to just sort of point out that if you can sort of find out more about what Rae was talking about tonight by picking up her book here, Lead for the Planet, and that is her book. There's this Mireille's book is called The Story of CO2, and David's book is Solved, and all of which are now available. They're available from the University of Toronto Press website. And at this moment, it would also be great if you could pick them up at your local independent bookstore, as they absolutely need your support right now, particularly this season as things are shut down. Again, I would like very much to thank Sara Burch for moderating tonight. The new edition of Sara's book, Understanding Climate Change, comes out in the new year, so do look for that. It is an absolutely great sort of foundational text on all of these matters, and to our two panelists with us, David Miller and Mireille Ghoussoub, and then in absentia, Rae André. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues Jane Kelly and Anna Maria Del Cole, who are hiding behind the screens, who certainly put all of this together. So thank you all very, very much. The conversation will continue. There are some phenomenal questions, and we will be finding a way to get them to the panelists and get them addressed in due course on our social media platforms. in the next little while. So anyway, thank you all very much. Have a great evening, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.